Welcome to the Underwater Podcast, where we take a deep dive into the world of underwater portrait photography, cinematography, and everything in between. With me, your host, Brett Stanley. This week on the Underwater Podcast, I'm discussing lifestyle and nude photography with LA-based photographer Damon Loble. Damon has a wonderfully lo-fi style about his images, reminiscent of the photos of the 70s and 80s, and his work with scuba divers totally reminds me of the Hardy Boys book covers I used to see as a child. Damon also works as a DIT on commercial photoshoots, a job that entails color correcting files on the fly so clients can approve the images. This gives him a huge head start when it comes to grading his own photos. We chat about the beauty of the Miami sunrise, working with models in the cold, open waters of Southern California, and how to perfect the elusive under-overshot that he's so well known for. Alright, let's dive in. Damon, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here.
So let's just kind of get into it. So how did you get into underwater? Was it something that you'd done, like had you always had an affinity for the water when you were a kid, or was it something you kind of found later in life?
Well, from a photographic standpoint, I've always loved water. And I've only been shooting underwater probably the last 5 years. I've been a diver longer than that. I actually got my license, I think, when I was 15. But, my regular photography always had an element of, water. Let's, make things wet. I just think water is beautiful and I love being in water.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I was taking a trip to Belize one summer, and I was going there to do more scuba certification. And I thought, I've got these Nikon cameras. On a whim, I went to the local camera shop and bought, a nice underwater housing for it to take to Belize.
And were these like digital cameras or film cameras?
It was a Nikon D810 at the time. Right. And yeah. I didn't know anything about underwater housings. I went to Sammy's Camera, spoke to a guy who was also a diver selling the cameras, and I ended up buying a Nauticam housing with the 7.5 inch, acrylic dome and a 16 to 35, which is a lens form. I hadn't been working with wider angle lenses up to that point. Everything had been, just the standard 24-70, 80-200, plus primes, which turned out to be kind of eye-opening and changed, I think, my work pretty substantially after that.
And so what were you shooting before you got into underwater? Is it the similar style stuff, the same kind of nudes, or was that something else?
Yeah, no, I've always been kind of an art nude person. And, when I bought the housing, I didn't feel like I was necessarily going to use it for people. I, really
Right.
wanted to use it as an extension of like my diving, which, I had a resurgence for about 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was just when you're a diver and you understand and you dive in areas that have beautiful underwater topography, like, ironically, Los Angeles has such great diving.
With the kelp fields and everything.
With the kelp and the light. And, you just, after a while, if you're a photographer, you're just like kind of sad that you're not able to work down there. And so, the trip to Belize, which I thought would be, more beautiful water, we were going to the Big Blue Hole. And I, just wanted to have a camera for that. And so I pulled the trigger, went down there, did some certifications, and kind of taught myself how to use the housing. And it was so much fun. I couldn't believe it.
And what sort of stuff were you shooting down there? Was it just the landscape and the kind of wildlife stuff as you were training?
Yeah, it was, well, not while I was training, but it was really the idea of just the novelty of being underwater, and it's just knowing the people that sort of liked my photography. I thought this would be an interesting sort of like, sidecar for them. Just here's an entirely different aspect of what I shoot. And it was exciting because, you mentioned in the introduction that I'm a DIT, which means I'm pretty good at the color work. And being underwater gave me a really, unique challenge as to how to grade an image. And you see a lot of underwater diving photography that is essentially uncolor graded or poorly color graded. And And I wanted to see if I could translate my that 70s retro vibe into underwater and think about, the stuff we've seen in magazines and all the images we see online now that bring back, magazine scans from the early underwater work. And it's just, the palettes were just so alluring, translated to underwater, that I just wanted to try to accomplish that.
Was that coloring, that kind of grading, were you doing those kind of grades before you got into the underwater, or was it something you found and applied once you started shooting underwater?
I think that's always kind of been the trajectory, is to have, 2 decades of lag in what is a normal sort of color processing right now, 2 to 3 decades, I guess. I just like the idea of something feeling a little more timeless. And I think, for timeless for me, I'm 45. So timeless for me is obviously, not too far of a step backwards. But as we grew up, we were raised on certain palettes in our images. And, if you're impressionable as a young man or as a teenager, you see things and you think, well, that's the way it should be. And as you grow into an adult with capabilities, you kind of want to recreate, in a sense, I think, those iconic moments that, you acquired in your mind, like the images you've seen that really sort of sparked a fascination. And I think that's where some of the grading comes from, and it's just one of those things that, like, I think people have always said is a unique perspective in the work. And granted, sometimes it leads me into disaster with image sets, but I think I've also had some stuff done that looks pretty great.
What do you class as a disaster? What does that mean?
I'll be flicking through, a Capture One session or a Lightroom session and just realize I hate everything and nothing works. Right. And so you put it away for a few months, and sometimes you want to go back and see if you were really just angry that day or if really nothing works. And a good portion of the time nothing worked that day, so you just put it away again.
Right. And I think that's a pretty common thing for photographers in general, I think, where you look at your work and you think, this is not what I wanted to do. This is not what I was aiming for at all. And you might come back to it like a week, a month, a year later, and with new eyes. And, for me, like 50% of the time I'm finding stuff that I didn't even realize was there, but that I'd written off the day I shot it. And I think we're so close to our work sometimes that we kind of can write it off just because it didn't quite go to plan.
It's true. It's funny because, like, every time, I work primarily in Capture One for the initial grading, but every time they release a new version, they seem to substantially change the color engine, and you end up developing a new set of grades, like sort of a new set of, homemade presets that you use to start a grading on an image. And every time I do that, I actually think about the images that like failed me, and I'll go back to them, upgrade, the session and upgrade the processing engine for it and apply new grades. And I've actually, found a few things just through, technology improving or whatever. But, sometimes, as your work evolves, you can reach back and rescue things that, you might have like dismissed.
I think that's such a good way to look at it too, is that as it's not you kind of changing so much, it's your tools changing that give you a new perspective on.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Sometimes you're just maybe not in the right headspace for what you shot that day. And, obviously, if you've dismissed it twice over and you go back and you find something that works, it probably wasn't your best work to begin with. But, maybe now with a new perspective, essentially tools for grading, you find something that is kind of interesting, and it does kind of shift maybe, this was a great idea back then, or this was an acceptable idea, but how can I make that better? And it kind of informs like, your next 3 months or 4 months of shooting.
So to say, if you did go back and, reworked some old images that you did, and then you liked what you did with the new tools or the new upgrades, would that change how you then shoot and edit from then on?
Possibly. Not always, but yeah, certainly. I think that, the underwater shooting is still low enough volume that I can remember the specifics of generally every shoot. And so when you find something that works, that suddenly does work, or maybe, if you're lucky, works spectacularly well under new grading system, you kind of want to see if you can replicate it with, fresh people or fresh vistas and improve on it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it too, is just, constantly evolving and kind of rolling these things into your workflow as the tools and everything kind of evolve as well. How would you actually describe your style? Because to me, it's got such a unique and very distinctive look. How would you describe it?
I guess I would describe it as somewhat aspirational. I mean, I'm not a fashion person, and I'm certainly not, a commercial photographer, and I'm not a fine art photographer. I just think that I make images that I enjoy, or rather I try to create images that, like I said earlier, represent or are pulled from like those iconic images that I've seen and that I really was attracted to. So it's like I'm always chasing the tail of, these greats. And these people who created these images may have only produced like 5 great images in their lives, or they might have produced 5,000 great images. But the 5 images from that person that I've seen, inform, so much of my work down the road. I think it's like an attitude or a moment just in that image that I latch onto, and that's what I'm going for. So, realistically, I think my work is maybe bent more towards camera aficionados, people who enjoy photography. I don't think that I will be a critic's darling. I don't think that I have high conceptions that are really pushing the medium forward. But I think that I create this, general atmosphere where, someday, it could be in a sexy hotel, Marriott, style artwork on a wall somewhere.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think like your style to me is kind of more Ace Hotel. Like, I think it's got that kind of, I haven't heard you say the word vintage or retro, but that to me it's got that kind of bent to it. Like there's a bit of a 70s, 80s kind of film flavor in there.
Yeah, I would prefer nostalgic over vintage or retro. But I mean, obviously I use the most modern tools available to produce it. I'm not a film shooter. I don't use vintage lenses. I use, the most recent version of Capture One, Photoshop, or, occasionally Lightroom. And it's a massaged process, but, it's also an organic process in the sense that half of the look, comes from using retro tools like heavy filtration on the lens and just various things that can, interrupt a perfect digital capture. Yeah. And so that's done, in the spirit of creating a nostalgia. And I recognize not shooting on film, I'm not ever going to fully recreate that. And I don't want to, if that's not my thing. But what I want to do is, take our modern world that we, photographic world that we live and work in, and just bring the elements forward that I enjoyed so much from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, 60s, I guess even. Yeah. Just there's so much wealth of just color that the history of film photography has given us, that we can, we don't have to be stuck in Instagram level palettes. We can do more interesting work and still, I think, be relevant.
Oh, for sure. And I love the way that you've kind of defined it by a certain word. Like nostalgia, I think it is totally different meaning than vintage and retro. Like nostalgia, I think is remembering that thing, whereas vintage and retro is just it was then. Whereas I think what you're doing is really merging two worlds, using this technology to create these, high resolution images, but then running them through the nostalgia, like kind of basically, I don't know, marinating them and flavoring them with the memories and the time that you kind of associate most with or have a love for. And then these images come out the other end having this really unique kind of bent, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you. It's like, I imagine one of my greatest influences would be Slim Aaron. And, if he had been shooting, underwater, the level that he was shooting above water, I think that we would have an order of magnitude more underwater fashion photography. Somebody who has, who captured the bon vivant of his day in color in an underwater setting. Slim Aaron could have redefined everything.
Yeah. What sort of thing was he doing? I'm not familiar with his work, but what sort of era was he in?
He was like 60s, 70s, 80s. He was sort of the American Helmut Newton. He started off doing these immense family portraits in Bel Air and Beverly Hills, and then moved into fashion, and then ultimately moved to Monte Carlo and the French Riviera. And some of his most beautiful work is just this, lifestyle of the south of France, essentially.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And that's pretty iconic.
Yeah, it's completely iconic. Just big spaces, lots of people, beautiful, people, of course.
And so how do you deal with working with people? You're kind of reasonably intimate kind of situations with models, mostly female models. Do you do stuff with male models as well? I
don't typically work with men, and simply because it's really hard to find men who are comfortable like that. I mean, yeah, it's obviously some people do find them very easily. I've not had an opportunity to really, do that. Some of my dry work, I guess, has had some decent men, but I mean, I would absolutely love to somehow figure out how to incorporate the male into the image sets. It's definitely, it definitely feels like overweighted, and it would be fun to balance it out.
I think it's just from my experience of shooting with males and females, it's a very different way of directing and shooting with a male than a female. I'm not sure what the difference is, but I definitely feel maybe I'm more conditioned by society to know what looks beautiful with a woman, whereas I'm not conditioned so much with men. I'm not sure if maybe it's just a lack of experience, but that seems to be, for me, where it kind of, there's a definite transition. You can't use the same sort of techniques or tricks or skills to get them to kind of give you the poses that you want. Have you kind of come across that with the men that you have actually worked with?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we end up, when we're unsure, we end up defaulting to, our gender perceptions. And, every time I photograph a guy, I want to make him look stronger, resolute, it's just like, and it's a little bit concerning that, I have those gender I don't want to say misconceptions, but I have these gender perceptions of how to photograph people certain ways. And, it's probably one of the weaknesses of my work, realistically, is that I don't have this fluidity to be able to move back and forth, seamlessly.
I think it's very a societal thing where we pick up all these things from advertising or imagery or whatever, that's what we fall back on.
I agree.
Let's talk about your actual kind of working kind of style, like your workflow. When you're shooting underwater, how do you kind of start? Are you thinking of concepts beforehand, or are you just kind of getting to a location with a model and then kind of working it out from there? How much forethought goes into these images?
I'd say it's a pretty strong mix of zero forethought to some forethought.
Right. Yeah.
Anybody who knows me or has worked with me has probably had to deal with my lack of preparation and, imagination.
Right.
And I think, people will ask for mood boards, and I don't have a mood board. I have 5 or 6 images, like I talked about earlier, that like really it's what I'm after in my life. And those are the 5 or 6 images that I'm always pulling, or trying to recreate one aspect or another. Right. So
it's fairly organic in terms of how you create stuff.
Yeah, it's organic in that sense. And I've come to rely a lot on the creativity of the people I'm working with. And some people are so good that you can't help but be brought up to their level in a way.
Right.
You look at certain sets of images I've done, and it's, I look at it and I'm extremely like gratified when I look at these images. And then you have to realize that it wasn't so much me, it was really that I happened to have this particular individual who was very good at playing in that role or becoming that atmosphere that, the image is. Yeah. And, some directors, some photographers can take their own energy and like bend the world around it. And I'm not that person. I'm the person who, really just tries to carve a piece out of it, out of what's going on.
And so you're kind of taking what's given to you and then dealing with that and kind of interpreting that through the lens, as opposed to, as you say, someone else kind of basically shooting all their energy out to control everything else, or not even control, but to, direct everything else.
Right. And you can get away with it if you have a technical proficiency with your equipment, which I do. I feel like technically I'm proficient. If you weren't proficient with equipment, and, a good example would be give me a motion camera in the water and, all hell breaks loose because I'm not proficient. But with stills, I am extremely confident in my abilities to use the equipment, not necessarily get a great image, but I don't feel like my operator skills as a photographer hold me back. So the sort of definitive question is, am I going to be able to sync with the person well enough, their energy and their, to create a set of images? If we get along in the water, if we have this ability to kind of understand where we're both going with stuff, then we get great shots. And if we can't develop it, then we might get something that's technically good, but not something that you're, extremely like enthusiastic about.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an important point, is that knowing your gear and knowing how to do basically your job, which is the taking and the creating of the images, is so important to having a good final result, because it means that you're not so concentrating on what you're having to do. You can then kind of work with the other person, the model or whoever it is, to kind of create this image between you, as opposed to freaking out because the settings aren't what you're used to, or you're not being able to think of two things at once, say, like being able to direct and also think about composition. I think sometimes it's people who jump into this kind of underwater world and think that they're going to be able to create stuff amazingly straight away, but then they're struggling to use their equipment, which I think, just having practice and getting in there and kind of learning basically your end of the deal makes it so much easier to create everything as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. When you don't look like you're struggling, I think that it reflects backwards or back to you, from your talent. And they see that you're competent in the water, and they feel more free to do what they want to do because, they're aware that you can probably follow them through what they feel like doing.
So I think you bring up a great point there, where it's, if you're not as comfortable and as solid in the water, then they're not going to be as solid either, because they're looking to you as basically the leader of this kind of project. They're looking at you to kind of keep them safe and to kind of keep them reassured. So if they're not as experienced as you, I think sometimes they're really relying on you a lot to get them through it. And that kind of leads us into shooting into open water as opposed to shooting in pools and tanks and stuff, which I know you do a lot of open water stuff with boats and kind of getting out onto the islands around LA. How do you find the differences between that, and how do you get your models comfortable in those environments?
That's a really great question. Shooting in pools in LA is nice. It's beautiful. One of the things you have to worry about when you shoot in a pool is A, is it filtered? B, is it aerated with a bunch of micro bubbles?
Oh, I love the micro bubbles.
Yeah, the micro bubbles. See what's in the background, because you mentioned I do a lot of above below splits, and shooting in pools, you have to have sort of all of this kind of working for you. You can have a beautiful pool, clean, crisp, clear, warm, even, that's comfortable to be in, and then a background that just is so phenomenally bad that you can't work in that pool. Yeah. And for me, like, I'm not like you, where I have the ability to imagine these really amazing sets. I shoot an environment that is the environment, which is a pool. And honestly, like the the creativity is how I work with the light and incorporate the above below with the background of the environment of the pool, not, the pool as the stage, with a set on it. And so shooting just underwater for me in a pool is kind of boring. Like it doesn't, the elements I need to make a successful picture generally aren't there. There's been a few I've had that are okay, but generally speaking, I can't do what you do with your underwater stuff.
But I think what you're doing is more grounded in reality. So a lot of like you're using what's already there and making a story around that. Whereas what I'm doing is basically creating something that's not there.
Right. Exactly. So you take a pool, which is a confined location, a lot of controllable elements, the ability to really reorient a subject if the background is amenable to, pivoting the camera one way or another. Makes for an easy, lots of shots day. We keep trying stuff till we get it right. Whereas when we go to open water, like, the channel or off the coast of the islands, we have an entirely different set of circumstances. Like, first of all, we know the water isn't going to be as nice, but that becomes a characteristic of the image. Like, it's not Tulum, it's not Cozumel. We don't have this perfect blue water. We have sometimes really nice water and sometimes really lousy water. We also have cold water. So when I select models, I honestly, I have to ask, how brave are you? How willing to go for the shot are you? And,
I think that's what sets a lot of that open water work of yours apart, is that these models seem to be fearless. Like they're in this, I don't know what, mid 60s, 70s degree water, and they don't look like they're cold. They don't look scared. I think is incredible. Is there something that you're sort of teaching them and training them when you're out there?
Not really. I mean, again, I think you hit on it. You provide a certain amount of leadership or just leading by example. And I know, I'm a little bit heavier guy than these girls. I've significantly more body fat, so I'm insulated and I'm used to being in this water temperature. It's, even as a diver, even though I typically would wear a dry suit if I was diving out here, in the summer months, I will just be in my swimsuit as a solidarity to a lot of these people, especially, when you're freediving, it just makes it so much easier.
Yeah, there's a lot less drag, and I think it makes the models feel better if you're freezing as much as they are, or you look like you're freezing as much as they are.
For sure. But then these girls, they have to go hard. I mean, realistically, the most successful images I've had out in the open water have been from people who just go for it. They will shoot for 20, 30 minutes out in the water during a 3 dive day, and they'll be amazing. Like the first dive, is a shock. The first time they jump in is a shock, and then they acclimate, and then we shoot a 20, 30-minute session, and then they get out of the boat or get out of the water and onto the boat where it's warm and sunny, and they fall asleep for the second dive. I mean, it's just the nature of it. You can't put somebody in this environment for 30 minutes and expect that they're going to go all day. It's just, you can't do it. So when you shoot, you just have to understand that you are going to have fewer shots that day. And, a few boats out here have hot tubs on board that do really help people sort of recover. But that second dive is never going to happen. You're only going to be shooting on 2 dives, generally speaking, every day. And but the third dive is, always a magic dive because they've warmed up, they know what they're expecting, and, assuming the weather hasn't turned against us, they go in, with an attitude of this is the last dive of the day. Let's do something really great. And some of my best images have always been from that third dive after, a practice morning dive. It's just everybody seems to be, maybe it's that they've had lunch and a nap, but they're able to go and push everything for that last dive.
That's amazing because I think they've, like you say, they've kind of built up to it. And I think knowing the environment as well, knowing the things that they can play with, because I see you use the anchor line from the boat a lot, and you're up on the shore of the islands and kind of getting those half and half shots. Is it them just sort of getting more comfortable with all those environments?
It is. And it's also it's a pretty magical thing. Like most people don't get to ride up and down on an anchor line as the boat's, bobbing in the ocean. And to swim 200 yards from a boat in the open ocean to a remote shoreline is a challenge, but it's also kind of it's kind of a treat. Like this isn't something they get to do every single day. It's an experience. And I think that's, the other part of the draw is that you're looking for people who are willing to step out of that comfort zone and go for it. I've had some days where like the people just, say they're good for it and they get out there and they turns out for whatever reason, it's just not something that they can handle. And I can respect that because it's hard to bring yourself to jump off a boat sometimes. I've been a diver with tanks and not wanted to jump off a boat sometimes. So jumping out off a boat with very minimal protective equipment, if any, can be daunting. And part of shooting it for me is also the exploration of like seeing a person sort of come into their own doing that. Like it's just, there's something really unique when you see somebody who is a little bit nervous. And, people don't generally like to admit that they're nervous, but you can kind of see it. And, I'm nervous on the first dive of every day anyway. And so I understand it. But watching somebody jump into the water and suddenly become comfortable and creative after having not been that way previously is really rewarding. And then, they have a 2-hour ride back to the mainland to take a nap at the end of the day.
Have you done any of these kind of shoots in warmer water? Have you had models like say in Miami or, back in Belize or anything?
In Miami, I haven't shot off of a dive boat. Miami's like probably one of my most favorite places to shoot in the water, just simply because it's such a shallow sloping shelf that as you wade in, you can play in the waves from the shore. But it's just, there's something just, Miami has a special place for me. I just love the water in Miami. Yeah. And even though I'm constantly worried a bull shark is going to tear my calf off, it's like everything I've shot out there is just amazing to me.
Right. Do you feel like you get different style of shots out there? Are you getting different things from the models because it's a warmer water, or is it still kind of the same dynamic?
I think the water, because it's warmer, the models are much more comfortable, and because it's also gentler. If you want to be out in the surf or in the waves in Miami, you can get like the rolling characteristic of the water with the model in Miami because it's not coming in to punish them like it would be in Los Angeles. There's no way I'll take one of my housings out into that mid surf zone in LA.
No.
Because you get hammered. And Miami is it's this gentleness that I just love. And especially if you wake up early in Miami and you can shoot the sun rising, there's just something so beautiful about that. The rising out of the water versus setting into the water.
Well, so that's an interesting point as well. Is lighting wise, do you tend to use lights, or are you just sticking with what's natural? And if it's natural, is there a certain time of day that you prefer?
Yeah, I'm primarily a natural light photographer. For proper diving, I'll bring a set of hot lights. I've got Keldon lights that I'll rig off my camera, and
so video lights,
and they're color balanced. They've got filter systems on front of them to balance the magenta back to like the water tone, so that when I do sort of try to grade back to a white point plus sort of nostalgic feeling, I don't have a hard magenta cast in any sort of like skin tone or reflective white surface from the lights. But we're deeper down, and having those lights does help pop out the black details in a diver's suit or diver's equipment and just separate things so they're not just a black mass with a pair of eyes.
Yeah.
But otherwise, when I'm shooting models in the water, I'm never deeper than 10 or 15 feet maximum. I've yet to shoot somebody who's as accomplished a free diver as I am a scuba diver. And if they were an accomplished free diver, I don't think I could follow them as deep as they would want to go.
Right. Do you take models down and have them on regulators and kind of buddy breathing down there, or are they all sort of swimming down to you and then going back up again?
I have them swim down. It's too much of a liability to ask somebody to use compressed air underwater unless I knew that they were a competent scuba diver in their own right. It's just, it's not safe. It's not intelligent. I've done it in a pool, but mostly because I wanted to have them on scuba in a pool.
That was a specific look you were going for.
Specific, yeah.
But so let's kind of talk about the deeper stuff you're doing. So you do outside of the art nude kind of stuff, you also do kind of what I call diver lifestyle shots, but it's mostly around the GUE, which is the Global Underwater Explorers. Is that right?
That's right.
Talk to us about that, because I find that sort of thing quite fascinating, and it's such a contrast to your other work.
Well, I think realistically, my work, like I said, my work is nostalgia based, and I think that the nude, so the model nude surface, just below surface stuff, and then the diver in the GUE style tech diver in full gear sort of play to like my aspects. There's something about the nature of like man wanting to explore and be the dominant species on this planet, like the fearless adventurer.
Yeah.
And when you take divers who are trained technical divers, and then you take, or especially divers who are trained in the GUE system, the Global Underwater Explorers sort of like regimen, you have people who look really, really good in the water.
Yeah.
And I know we've all seen photos of divers that are like cattywampus, upside down, vertical in the water. And, we don't understand that is actually poor form of diving until you see real trained tech divers doing their craft underwater. And these guys, when you get them together as a group working, because they tend to work together as a group, when you get them, it's like there's just something magical about showcasing off the teamwork and the discipline and like the gravity of what they want to do underwater.
Yeah.
There's a hero worship, I think, that kind of goes into the ability to use what seems like extraneous equipment underwater, but this equipment exists because they take their diving to such a level and a depth of seriousness that it's necessary to have it. And then to see them handle it with such finesse and to make these controlled, subtle movements in what is 300 to 400 pounds of gear sometimes, on dry land, to see them do that underwater is just, it's poetic.
And the times that I've seen them, the GUE divers, to me, they're kind of like a mix of like a paratrooper and like a Hardy Boys kind of novel cover, but all underwater. So it's, for the people listening, if you see a GUE diver, they're basically looking like military, not in the colors and the style and stuff, but just how kind of regimented they are, and every piece of equipment on them is there for an exact reason. Sometimes they got 2 or 3 of everything. They're very imposing under the water, and they're so, I guess, yeah, like you say, regimented in the way that they float in the water, that they are dead horizontal and just have this beautiful form. Yeah,
and it's from a photographic perspective, it's just so interesting to watch them in the water. And it was the reason I began training with that same agency. But like, there's just something that to photograph divers who are not GUE trained is completely interesting to me. I know that sounds really elitist and really probably asinine, but it's the same reason we photograph models versus, any old person, off the street.
There's a characteristic that you're after.
There's a character that I'm after. And I think that is encapsulated in that, the training and like the mentality of the GUE diver. And again, I bend it back towards the model. Like the models I work the best with seem to be able to come up with this character. And it's not the world conquering, underwater explorer character. It's just, they are able to come into a character that gives me that same sort of like tingly sense in the brain when I'm working with them.
Oh, totally. And I think what you get out of your models, both divers and the art nude, is there's a sense of confidence in them. There's really very rare that I look at one of your photos and look at someone and they look overly vulnerable. They tend to look powerful, at least in control.
In control, I think, is a good word. Yeah, I don't think that powerful, I'm not looking for powerful people, but I'm looking for people who are in control of what they seem to exhibit control over their atmosphere, their environment.
And with your commercial work, because I know you've done a little bit of commercial work, but mostly for dive brands, have you done much of that?
Yeah, some. Again, a lot of it because, up until recently, with COVID, I was working DIT and haven't had need to have a huge commercial client base for myself.
Yeah.
Most of the dive brands don't want to shoot the way I want to shoot. Mm-hmm. So it's generally uninteresting. I've had a few dive brands tell me that they need models who are less attractive because they feel that the way I was shooting was unrealistic to the demographic who would use their products. That was kind of a turnoff. And it's I enjoy photography. Like I truly enjoy photography, and I don't want to change what I do just to make a paycheck. It's too important to me to change the way or my approach to shooting just to make a few dollars. That said, there are some clients who are completely, for it. And those are the people you want to work with. And I suspect that every photographer world over feels exactly the same way. And some are better at bending themselves. And if you're the kind of person who is willing to bend yourself, I mean, it's fully valid. That's because that's the way you think and it's the way you feel. And I'm not disparaging that mentality at all. But, knowing myself, I just can't really get up in the morning to shoot something that I'm really uninterested in doing or don't kind of believe in at the end.
And do you think that would show in the final work? Do you think it would not be as powerful as the work you are invested in?
I think so, but that could also be the lazy part of me saying that. I mean, it could be that, you become invested if you care enough. And maybe what I'm saying indicates that I just don't care enough, to be quite honest. But again, because it's not my primary source of income, I would prefer to have the photography still be a place of my personal growth, the stuff that I like to do.
And I mean, that's why you started it, because it was something that scratched an itch inside your head and it was a way for you to create. And if that creation is not, kind of reliant on you putting food in your mouth, then it certainly makes you a lot more flexible in that lifestyle.
It makes me flexible in the lifestyle is a good way to put it.
So that's really cool. I mean, I love that you're sticking to your guns. And as you say, there are photographers who will be flexible in their work life for their clients. And I think you have to be able to do a range of clients. But there's also photographers who are strict in what they do. And that's why they get hired, because they only do this thing to a certain quality. People want them to do their projects because of how strict they are and how much they won't bend.
I think that's true.
So we're kind of coming to the end of this now, but what I want to kind of get an idea from you is there any kind of tips for people working with models in the way that you do? Like, are there ways that they should be approaching these models? Are there ways that they should be talking to them? Are there things that they should avoid? Obviously, it's a quite an intimate style of photography. What are the kind of etiquette things that they shouldn't be doing or should be doing?
I mean, I think it's just basic instinct. Like if you feel like you are verging on something that's inappropriate or you're verging on something that's uncomfortable, then you don't go there. And I think that you constantly ask your models like about their comfort, and you give them many opportunities to be like, no, like this is too much. Like I'm not happy in the water right now. I'm cold. I'm nervous. Let's not shoot this.
Yeah.
I think it's just a constant, always checking in, honestly, every few minutes, just make sure that they feel like you actually give a damn about where their head's at. And then beyond that, don't be a jerk.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. Common sense and don't be a jerk.
Specifics, if you are shooting in the open water, make sure you have some kind of flotation for them so that they're not treading water, in the off time. I bought 5 of those long foam floaty lifeguard rescue buoys, and they're incredibly useful for just hanging off of in the water. And when you're hanging off of it, you're naturally buoyant. And it can be comfortable. Everybody relaxes, and you can actually enjoy the fact that A, maybe you're naked floating in the Pacific Ocean, or B, you're just not getting tired from from kicking.
Yeah.
And if you're, you know, from a gear perspective, if you are trying to do splits in the middle of open water, the underwater housings with their large domes are very heavy. And if you take that buoy and rest it between the dome and your body, it's a perfect balance for, you know, getting the camera on the split level you want. Trying to do it without that, you're constantly finning, and, you know, as you're finning, you're you know, invariably you're pushing yourself out of position.
Yeah, and tiring yourself at the same time.
And tiring yourself.
That kind of is a good kind of thing to finish on, because the under overs that you do, and I've tried to do these, and they are not easy from my point of view, but you make them look so easy. Are there, I mean, you just gave us a couple of kind of tips then, which is putting a float under it and keeping it up. For doing the under overs, is there any technique that you kind of think is paramount?
The bigger the dome, the better, honestly.
Yeah.
You know, I've got...
What are you shooting on? What kind of dome have you got?
I have two systems. I have the Nauticam housing and then I have a Nauticam housing for my D850. And I have the 180 mil dome, and I have the 240 mil dome. And the over-unders on the 240 mil are so much easier, or so much better. You know, again, the problem is that 240 mil dome is extremely front weighted. So if you don't have support in open water, it's a beast. So if you want to just do work in the open water and you don't want to have to carry a float around, I'd recommend the 180 mil style dome, or even the 7.5 inch acetate, which is a really light dome, and actually a very nice dome, and it's the most affordable of all of them. You know, and I think doing a split is a function of just finding the sweet spot of focal length and water clarity. So, you know, I've had a few times where I've been able to somehow, and, you know, it's a miracle when it happens, but you're able to find a convergence above and below where there's virtually no magnification. Even though a dome is supposed to give you that, there, you know, depending on focal length, you're going to get some magnification or some diffusion of the image above and below. So finding that sweet spot, which can be, for me, is about 30 millimeters on the 10-inch dome, is kind of where I can pull strong detail around F8, F11, you know, above and below, and make it feel as if it's just the water is glass.
And you need that kind of small aperture to be able to get the above and the below to kind of match, right? If you go too wide an aperture, you start to get too much difference between the two.
Too much. But I mean, you know, there's a photographic aesthetic to that as well. But some of my favorite shots are when the water just sort of disappears. And again, we talk about, you know, I mentioned like the nature of the background of the pool. You can't have, if you're going to do something like that, at F11 at 30 mil, everything's going to be generally really sharp. So you need to make sure that the environment behind you like accommodates that level of detail.
Yeah, that it's actually interesting and nice and adds to the photo, as opposed to being some sort of ugly swimming pool or backyard.
Yeah. And then, you know, the other things is you just obviously have to pay attention to, like, do you have light that works above and below? Like I've blown so many images where, you know, the light above just is so beautiful and I think everything is great. And then, you know, when I go to process the images, the light below, just for whatever reasons of refraction, it just falls to like muddiness, and it doesn't work. So, you know, it's just paying a lot of attention, and, you know, it's easy to get caught up in the moment when you're shooting and spinning and moving, and you wind up in a situation where, like, you either have water droplets on the dry side of the dome that ruin everything, or, you know, like I said, the light doesn't work below, or the light works really well below, and that's what kind of you're focusing on, is like this incredible lighting that's going on below, and then above it's just like it's broad and the angle's too high and everything looks like blown out. There's a lot of maddening aspects to, you know, sometimes you'll look at the back of your screen and think like we've nailed it, and then you get in to post-process the image and you realize like you blew everything because there's a few small details you overlooked.
Yeah. If you're in a shoot session, are you saying, all right, let's do some under overs now? Or is it kind of like, are you throwing one in every now and again just as you see something that's going to work?
Well, pretty much everybody who wants to work with me, I think, is looking for that shot. They want an under over somehow. So, it's like, as a one trick pony, I kind of feel obligated to do it. I mean, I love it. I mean, it is, but I almost always assume we're going to be getting in the water. I never start in the water. I want to start dry. Part of it being like, I'm not a photographer who's instantly on. I need to take 200 or 300 images before like the good part of my brain sort of kicks in. So I need that. Yeah, I need that ramp up period myself. It's also good to, if you want to have dry shots, to shoot them before obviously hair or makeup is ruined. Also, once you put a person in a pool, especially, a model who, has no heat resistance, once you put them in that pool, even if it's around 87 degrees, the working times drop dramatically. You can just watch like the life fade from the eyes. Like the enthusiasm they had when they got in is definitely not there 20 minutes later sometimes. And so I try to get to the underwater portion fairly soon, but I do need to do air shots, ramp up myself, and then move to the underwater, because the underwater of any shoot is kind of the meat and potatoes for me. That's the part I honestly want to get to as well. And I just want to make sure that we've covered bases before and we're ready to go.
Awesome, man. So Damon, thanks so much. This has been amazing. Just listening to you kind of talk through your process on these things and just hearing how you've created your own style and your own voice is really educational. And hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Yeah, man. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Damon.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening, everyone. And as always, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. If you'd like to connect with us or just learn more about my guests, you can hit our website at theunderwaterpodcast.com or on Instagram or Facebook. Also check out our regular live streams on YouTube. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to know more about my underwater photography workshops and mentoring, you can find me at brettstanley.com. The Underwater Podcast is presented and produced by me, Brett Stanley, and our music is Neo by Oh Boy. Keep creating, everyone. I'll see you in the water.